The most dangerous man in any corporate building isn't the one in the corner office. It's the one emptying the trash, because he sees what gets thrown away. Right now, a smug vice president is ordering a janitor to get on his knees and scrub coffee off the executive hallway floor. What that VP doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the man holding the mop is Victor Williams. 25 years old, the new owner of every floor, every office, and every paycheck in that building. For 5 days, Victor ran a ghost audit. He wore the same grey jumpsuit his mother wore on night shifts. He dug through executive trash cans. He clocked their 3-hour lunch disappearances. And he watched in silence as a brilliant young assistant named Maya was worked to the bone, her ideas stolen, her name erased, while the men above her took her work and wore it like a tailored suit. They thought he was wallpaper. In a few minutes, Victor is going to peel off that dirty uniform, put on his tailored suit and walk into the Friday boardroom. He isn't going to raise his voice. He isn't going to threaten anyone. He is simply going to reach into his pocket and pull out what he found in their trash. If you have ever been Maya, doing all the work, getting none of the credit, running on exhaustion and integrity alone, this story doesn't just end with a firing. It ends with something you've been waiting a long time to see. Like, subscribe, and stay until the final moment. Because that look on her face, you'll carry it with you. Victor arrived at 5:47 a.m. Not because he had to, because that was the time his mother used to leave the house, lunch packed in a plastic bag, uniform already on, moving through the dark so quietly she never woke him. He'd only learned that detail years later, when he was old enough to notice the worn path she'd left in the kitchen linoleum. He thought about that path now as he pulled the grey jumpsuit over his shoulders. It smelled like industrial detergent. The zipper stuck halfway up. The cap sat low enough that the brim cut his line of sight, forcing him to tilt his chin up slightly to see anything above shoulder height, which he realized was probably the point. People who empty trash aren't supposed to look anyone in the eye. He signed in under the name on his forged badge, V. Walsh, Facilities, and was handed a cleaning cart by a floor supervisor who didn't look up from his phone. The executive floor of Apex Corporation was, by any measure, stunning. Floor-to-ceiling glass, marble corridors, desks that cost more than most people's cars, arranged in a horseshoe around a central conference room with a view of the entire city skyline. Victor had seen the photographs in the acquisition file. In the photographs, it had looked like a place where serious work happened. By 9:15 a.m. on a Monday, it looked like a place where serious coffee was consumed and very little else. He pushed his cart slowly, methodically, the way he'd watched maintenance workers move his entire life, unhurried, invisible, occupying the edges of rooms. He wiped down surfaces that didn't need wiping. He emptied bins that were barely full. He listened. By 11 a.m., 3 of the 7 senior executives had arrived. By noon, 2 of them had left for lunch. They didn't come back. By 2 p.m., Victor stood in the center of the executive floor and counted the occupied desks. 1. A junior assistant at the far end, head down, fingers moving across a keyboard with the quiet intensity of someone fighting a deadline no one else knew existed. He'd noticed her earlier. She'd arrived before him, coat still on, coffee going cold beside her while she worked. Everyone else gone. Victor pulled a small notebook from his chest pocket, analog deliberately, and wrote the time. Monday, 14:03, 7 executive desks, 1 occupied. He slid the notebook back and looked around the empty floor. The leather chairs, the untouched whiteboards, the city glittering indifferently through the glass. His mother had mopped floors like these for 19 years. She'd done it so he would never have to. He gripped the cart handle, jaw set, and pushed it slowly toward the next corridor. He had 4 days left, and he was already absolutely certain of one thing. This company wasn't being led. It was being looted. The call came in at 10:22 a.m. Victor heard the phone before he saw it, a sharp, insistent ring cutting through the hum of the executive floor, the kind of ring that had urgency baked into it. He slowed his cart near the corridor junction and tilted his cap up just enough to see the desk it was coming from. It was the VP's office. Glass-walled, corner-facing, the best view on the floor. The nameplate read Richard Holt, Vice President of Client Relations, in letters thick enough to mean something. Richard Holt was not at his desk. Victor had watched him leave 40 minutes earlier, golf bag slung over one shoulder, blazer already off, telling his assistant he'd be back after lunch with a wave that suggested he considered that information generous. The phone rang 7 times, then stopped. Then started again. Victor positioned his cart beside a supply alcove 6 feet from the VP's open office door and began wiping down the same stretch of wall he'd already wiped twice. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed. From the far end of the floor, he saw her stand up. The junior assistant, the one who'd been first in again this morning, coat barely off before her fingers found the keyboard. She stood with her head slightly tilted, listening to the phone ring, clearly doing the mental calculation of how much trouble either option would cost her. Answer it and overstep. Don't answer it and lose something that mattered. She answered it. Apex Corporation, this is Maya Chen, how can I help you? Whatever came through that line made her sit down fast. She grabbed a pen. Then a second pen. Then she pulled up 3 windows on her screen simultaneously, and Victor watched her expression shift from apprehension into something else entirely, pure, quiet focus. The call lasted 11 minutes. The work it created lasted the rest of the day. He watched her rebuild the Horizon account from what sounded like near collapse, a missed deliverable, a miscommunication, a client ready to pull 8 figures off the table before the week was out. She spoke to their finance team, their logistics lead, their VP of procurement. She drafted revised projections. She redrew timelines. She sent holding emails with enough confidence and warmth that the client, who'd been furious at 10:22, was thanking her by 4:15. Victor didn't move far from that floor all afternoon. Richard Holt returned at 3:50 with a slight tan and a good mood. He glanced at Maya's screen as he passed, nodded vaguely at whatever he saw, and disappeared into his office without asking a single question. Victor emptied his trash at 4:30. Inside, a crumpled receipt from a golf club. Timestamp 11:08 a.m. He smoothed it flat, folded it once, and slid it into his chest pocket alongside the notebook. He was building something. And they were handing him every brick. The email went out at 9:07 a.m. Victor knew because he was wiping down the glass partition outside Richard Holt's office when Holt leaned back in his chair, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just done something he was proud of. The kind of lean that came after pressing send. He didn't have to see the screen. He heard Holt read it aloud to himself while typing the quiet, self-congratulatory murmur of a man rehearsing his own legend. Phrases drifted through the glass. My swift intervention, client confidence restored. The Horizon account remains secured under my leadership. Victor kept wiping. The glass was already clean, had been for 10 minutes. By mid-morning, replies were filtering back from the senior leadership chain. Congratulations, well done's. A note from the regional director calling it exactly the kind of decisive client management we expect at this level. Victor watched Holt forward that last 1 to 3 different people. Across the floor, Maya read none of it. She was already on the next thing, head down, working with the focused silence of someone who had long ago stopped expecting acknowledgement. Victor watched her and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not just anger. Something more like grief on her behalf, for every hour she had spent being quietly excellent in a room full of people who mistook her invisibility for mediocrity. He pushed his cart toward the far end of the floor at 4:30 when the executive desks had emptied out again. Standard Tuesday behavior, now confirmed on a Wednesday. The pattern was becoming a schedule. He was reaching for the bin beside Maya's desk when he heard her voice, low, turned slightly away, phone pressed close. He didn't mean to overhear. But the floor was empty, and her voice cracked on the 3rd word. And there are some sounds that stop you completely regardless of intention. I understand the payment is overdue. A pause. I know the amount. Another pause longer. I'm not disputing the bill, I'm asking if there's a plan, a payment schedule, anything, because I'm doing everything I can and I just need a little more. She stopped to listen. Please don't send it to collections, he's still recovering. He doesn't need that on top of. Her voice broke quietly, the way people break when they've been holding something heavy for a very long time, and simply run out of grip. Victor stood completely still. He didn't look at her. He gave her the only dignity available to him in that moment, the pretense that no one had heard. He emptied the bin slowly, set it back without a sound, and moved his cart toward the corridor. He walked to the supply room, sat down on an overturned crate in the dark, and stared at the floor. He thought about his mother. He thought about every bill she'd ever paid alone. And he made a decision he wouldn't act on until Friday. By 8 p.m. the building was a shell. The cleaners had come and gone on the lower floors. The security desk downstairs had switched to its night rotation. The executive floor held exactly 2 people, Maya, who hadn't moved from her desk in 4 hours, and Victor, who had found increasingly unnecessary reasons to remain on the same floor. He told himself it was thoroughness, that he was being diligent, that a good audit didn't clock out at 5. He almost believed it. Maya had been fighting the same spreadsheet since mid-afternoon. He could tell by the way she was sitting, spine no longer straight, one elbow on the desk, chin resting in her palm with the exhausted posture of someone losing an argument against a machine. The spreadsheet was enormous, a rolling financial model for the CEO's Friday presentation. 3 months of projections, cascading across dozens of columns in the pale blue light of the monitor. Victor kept his distance. He reorganized a supply cart that didn't need reorganizing. He retaped a floor sign that was perfectly secure. He stayed. At 8:14, Maya exhaled sharply through her nose, not quite a word, not quite a sound, and pressed both palms flat against the desk. The kind of gesture that meant something is wrong and I cannot find it. Victor glanced at the screen from 6 feet away. He saw it immediately. The Q3 projection column was off by a decimal point. A single misplaced digit, small enough to overlook in isolation, catastrophic enough to corrupt every dependent formula downstream. The kind of error that hid in plain sight and made entire financial models hemorrhage. He looked away. He looked back at his cart. He looked at the screen again. She was going to be there until midnight searching for it. Tomorrow was Friday. She had already given this company everything she had, and she was sitting alone in an empty building at 8 p.m. giving it more. He pushed the cart 2 feet forward. Then he stopped. Then, almost before the decision was fully formed, he leaned slightly toward the screen and said it, quiet, flat, almost involuntary. Move the decimal on the Q3 projections. It offsets the deficit. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Maya turned slowly in her chair. She looked at him the way people look at something that has just violated the rules of the world they understood. Her eyes dropped briefly to his jumpsuit, his cart, the worn cap, then back to his face. Victor straightened, cleared his throat once. My daughter does accounting at school. He gave a vague nod toward the screen. Looks similar to her homework. It was, without question, the worst thing he had ever said. Maya blinked. Then she turned back to the screen, moved the decimal, and watched every formula correct itself in a cascade of clean green numbers. She turned back around slowly. But he was already pushing the cart toward the corridor, walking at a pace that was not quite fleeing and not quite dignified. Behind him, for the first time all week, he heard Maya almost smile. She left the coffee on the edge of the cart without a word. Just set it there, a paper cup, still warm, a small wooden stirrer resting across the top like a tiny bridge, and went back to her desk without making it into anything. No explanation, no eye contact. The quiet gesture of someone who had decided a thing and done it before they could second-guess themselves. Victor looked at the cup for a long moment. Then he picked it up. He'd been working the far end of the corridor, doing almost nothing with great concentration, when she'd appeared beside him. Now he leaned against the wall across from her desk and drank the coffee slowly while she finished annotating the last section of the presentation binders. The floor was completely silent except for the soft rhythm of her pen and the distant mechanical breath of the building's ventilation. It was, he realized, the most comfortable he'd felt all week. After a while he said, "You've been here since 7 this morning." 7:30, she said without looking up. "That's not a correction that helps you." The pen stopped. She looked up at him with an expression that was almost a smile, the tired, genuine kind that only appears after a certain hour when people are too exhausted to perform anything. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it isn't." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. Outside, the city glittered at half its daytime intensity, the skyline reduced to its essential lights. "Why do you do it?" he asked. He kept his voice even, idle almost, the way you ask things when you want a real answer and don't want to frighten it away. "Work this hard, for people who," he paused, "for a boss who doesn't seem to notice." Maya was quiet for a moment. She capped her pen and sat back. My first week here, she said, I asked my manager whether the quality of the work mattered if nobody checked it carefully. He told me only the optics mattered. She looked at the binders stacked neatly beside her. I decided that day that he was wrong. That's not really an answer, Victor said gently. She considered that, then she said simply, my name might not be on the cover, but my integrity is in the pages. A small pause. How I do my work is who I am, that doesn't change based on who's watching. The corridor was very quiet. Victor looked at her for a moment, this exhausted, brilliant, undefeated person sitting alone at midnight, in a building that had spent a week trying to make her invisible, and felt something in his chest rearrange itself permanently. He finished the coffee, set the cup down carefully. Thank you, he said, for this. She nodded, already turning back to her work. He pushed the cart slowly toward the elevator, and somewhere between the corridor and the ground floor, Victor Williams made the last decision he needed to make. Tomorrow he was going to burn it all down and build something worth keeping from the ashes. They arrived like they owned the place, which Victor reflected from behind his cart at the end of the corridor was precisely the problem. Ownership without accountability, confidence without foundation. Richard Holt led the procession off the elevator at 8:45 a.m. looking like a man who had slept well, eaten well, and spent 0 minutes of his morning thinking about anyone but himself. Fresh suit, new tie, the particular brightness in his eyes that belongs exclusively to people anticipating applause. The others followed in his wake, 4 senior executives, all polished, all carrying the easy energy of people who believed today was going to be a formality. A handshake, a presentation, a new CEO who would be impressed by the numbers and grateful for the smooth transition. Maya was already at her desk. She had been there since 7. The presentation binders sat in a neat stack beside her keyboard, 12 copies, tabbed, printed, bound, and annotated. 4 hours of last night and 2 hours of this morning, distilled into cardstock and clean formatting. Victor had seen her finish the final one at 6:47 a.m. Holt walked past her without breaking stride, scooped the entire stack off her desk with one arm, and kept moving toward the conference room. Good work, he said, in the tone of someone complimenting furniture. Then he stopped, turned back halfway. The CEO's coming in at noon. I need you in the boardroom, back row, quiet, if anyone asks your support staff. He glanced at her desk as though assessing it. Don't speak unless I tell you to. Maya held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then she nodded once and looked back at her screen. Holt disappeared into the conference room, already handing out binders with the authority of a man distributing his own work. Victor watched all of it from the corridor. Then he pushed his cart to the service elevator, rode it to the basement, and walked through the connecting passage to the building's private residential tower without looking back. The penthouse was exactly as he'd left it Monday morning, suit on the rack, shoes on the mat, the room carrying the particular stillness of a space that had been waiting. He unzipped the jumpsuit slowly, let it fall. He stood under the shower until the industrial detergent smell left his skin entirely, then stood a moment longer, letting the week drain away with it. The sore shoulders, the invisible hours, the slow accumulated weight of watching people mistake silence for weakness. He dried off, he stood in front of the mirror. Then he dressed. Dark trousers pressed to a clean line, the fitted dress shirt light against the tailored jacket. He buttoned each button with the unhurried precision of someone who was, for the first time all week, exactly who he appeared to be. He looked at his reflection, 25 years old, broad-shouldered, jaw set, eyes carrying 5 days of absolute certainty, and straightened his collar one final time. The janitor was gone. Victor Williams had an appointment. He didn't rush. That was the first thing. The elevator opened at 11:58 a.m., and Victor Williams walked out of it at the pace of a man who understood that urgency is a language spoken by people who aren't in control. His footsteps were unhurried, deliberate, each one landing with the quiet authority of someone who had already decided how this day would end. The executive assistant outside the boardroom saw him first. She stood up automatically, the involuntary reflex of someone encountering a particular quality of presence, before she'd fully processed why. Mr. Williams, they're ready for you inside. Thank you, he said simply, and pushed open the boardroom door. The room stood. All of them, simultaneously, with the unanimous scramble of people trying to communicate enthusiasm through their bodies before their mouths could form words. Holt was at the head of the table. Victor noted that with a cool, private interest, already extending his hand, already smiling the wide, certain smile of a man holding what he believed were excellent cards. "Mr. Williams, welcome to Apex. We've been genuinely looking forward to this." Victor shook his hand, firm, brief. He let his eyes move around the room without hurry, taking in each face with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and revealed absolutely nothing. He was, he knew, not what they had expected. 25 had a way of surprising people who'd spent 20 years deciding what authority was supposed to look like. He'd watched it happen his entire career, the fractional recalibration behind their eyes, the slight adjustment as they quietly revised their assumptions about who was standing in front of them. Good, let them recalibrate. They were going to need the practice. He took the chair at the head of the table, his chair in his building, at his company, and settled into it with the ease of a man sitting somewhere he had always belonged. The presentations began. They were polished, he would give them that. Slides clean, language confident, each executive performing their portion with the rehearsed fluency of people who had spent the morning preparing to be impressive. Victor listened with his hands rested on the table, his expression attentive, his eyes steady and unreadable. Then Holt leaned forward and slid a document across the glass table with both hands, the gesture of a man presenting something precious. The Horizon account report, bound in a crisp navy cover, pristine, professional, carrying the quiet brilliance of every late night Maya Chen had poured into it. "Our most significant client retention win of the quarter," Holt said. The pride in his voice was immaculate, completely convincing, the performance of a man who had told the lie so many times it had started to feel like memory. "I personally managed the crisis from inception to resolution." Victor looked down at the report. He let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled, the slow, patient smile of a man who has been waiting all week for precisely this moment. "Tell me everything," he said. Holt talked for 4 minutes. Victor let him. He sat with his hands still on the table, his expression unchanged, his eyes fixed on Holt with the patient, unblinking attention of someone collecting every word like evidence, because that was exactly what he was doing. Holt described the Horizon crisis with the fluency of a seasoned storyteller, hitting every beat with practiced confidence. The urgent client call, his swift assessment, the revised projections he'd personally restructured, the relationship he'd single-handedly salvaged. It was, technically, an impressive performance. It would have been more impressive if Victor hadn't spent Tuesday afternoon 6 feet away from the truth. When Holt finished, the room held the warm, expectant silence of people waiting for applause. The other executives shifted forward almost imperceptibly, feeding off Holt's confidence, borrowing it. Victor reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the golf receipt on the table slowly, the way you set down something fragile. It sat between them on the glass, slightly crumpled, smoothed flat by careful hands, the timestamp reading 11:08 a.m. in crisp black ink. The name of the golf club printed neatly across the top. Nobody spoke. "That's Tuesday's timestamp," Victor said. His voice was completely level, not loud, not sharp, the tone of a man who has no need to perform anger because the facts are already doing the work. "The Horizon call came in at 10:22 a.m. You left the building at 9:40. He paused. "So when you say you personally managed the crisis from inception to resolution, I'm trying to understand the logistics of that." The colour left Holt's face in a slow, visible tide. Victor opened the Horizon report to page 4. He turned it to face Holt across the table and placed one finger on the top of the page. "Walk me through the financial reconciliation model on this page," he said. "Specifically the methodology behind the Q3 deficit offset." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Holt looked at the page, his mouth opened slightly. His eyes moved across the figures with the panicked, searching energy of a man trying to read a language he didn't speak. 3 seconds passed, then 5. The room had stopped breathing. Victor let it stretch, 8 seconds, 9, long enough that every person at that table understood exactly what the silence meant, long enough that there was no version of this Holt could recover from. Then Victor turned his head, slowly and deliberately, toward the back of the room. Maya was sitting where she'd been told to sit, back row, hands folded, quiet. She had been perfectly still for the past 20 minutes. but her eyes, fixed on page 4, were absolutely alive. Maya, Victor said. His voice was calm and clear and carried the full length of the room without effort. Since you actually wrote page 4 at 8:30 p.m. last night, a pause precise as a blade, would you care to explain it to him? Every head in the room turned. And Richard Holt finally understood what invisible truly meant. Maya stood up. Not immediately, there was a single breath of hesitation, the instinctive pause of someone who had spent years being told that standing up was not her place. But then she walked the length of the room with her chin level and her notes in her hand, and when she reached page 4, she explained the methodology in clear, precise language that made the model's elegance immediately obvious to everyone in the room. Everyone except Holt, who was no longer really in the room at all. He was somewhere behind his own eyes, very still, understanding the full architecture of what had just happened to him. When Maya finished, Victor said simply, "Thank you." Then he turned to Holt. Richard, he kept his voice exactly as it had been measured, unhurried, carrying no heat whatsoever, which was somehow worse than fury. HR and security are waiting outside this room with your termination papers. Please don't make them come in. Holt opened his mouth. "Don't," Victor said, one word, quiet as a closed door. Holt closed his mouth, pushed back his chair, and walked to the door with the diminished posture of a man trying to remember how his body worked. Two of the other executives, the ones whose names appeared on 3-hour lunch receipts currently sitting in Victor's inside pocket, were escorted out behind him by a security officer who had appeared at the door with the silent efficiency of someone who had been thoroughly briefed. The room resettled. Those who remained sat a little straighter, a little stiller, recalibrating in real time. Victor let the room breathe for a moment. Then he looked at Maya, still standing near the head of the table with the report in her hands, and said, "Sit here, please," gesturing to the chair directly on his right. She looked at the chair, then at him. "Here," he said again gently. She sat. Victor addressed the remaining room with the unhurried clarity of a man laying a foundation stone by stone. There would be a full structural review of the executive team. Performance would be measured by output, not optics. The culture of this floor, the 3-hour absences, the stolen credit, the deliberate diminishment of the people doing the actual work, was over, effective immediately. Then he turned to Maya. "Your father's medical bills," he said quietly, "will be paid in full by Apex Corporation. All of them, you'll have confirmation by end of day." Maya's expression didn't collapse. She was too composed for that, too practiced at holding herself together in rooms that had never been built for her. But something behind her eyes shifted, deep and irreversible. The way things move when a weight you've carried so long you've forgotten its shape is finally, completely lifted. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a breath. "You knew." "Since Wednesday," he said. "I'm sorry it took until Friday." He let that land, then he continued evenly so the whole room heard it clearly. "As of today, Maya Chen is Chief of Operations at Apex Corporation. She reports directly to me." He looked around the table. "If you have questions about what that means, page 4 of that report is an excellent place to start." He picked up his copy of the Horizon binder, looked at the cover for a brief moment, then set it back down. 5 days ago, he'd walked into this building carrying his mother's memory and a borrowed uniform. He'd come looking for who was bleeding his company dry. He'd found that. He'd also found something he hadn't known to look for. A person who worked with integrity in the dark, when no one was watching, not for recognition or reward, but simply because that was who she was. He thought his mother would have understood her completely. He thought his mother would have approved. "Welcome to the new Apex," Victor said. And for the first time all week, he meant it without reservation.